Dear friends, let's just kind of close our eyes and consider. In this very body you have 8 octillion atoms, 8 followed by 24 zeros. And each of those has an electron or several, so maybe about an average of 10 electrons per atom, 80 octillion electrons in your body. Even when you feel calm, relaxed, nothing is going on, all those electrons are vibrating. They're vibrating all the time. They vibrate unless it's absolute zero. And if it is, there's no problem. You don't need to worry about anything. There's always this vibration, this great amount of energy. It's going on and on and on, just never stopping, never ending. In this wonderful expanse of our universe, when things seem very solid, like tables and floors and ceilings, they're actually all vibrating. Everything is vibrating, everything is changing, everything is moving all the time. It's a tremendously exciting thing when we can kind of touch it. Everything is energy, everything is matter. The interconnection is just really intense. So today, just realizing how intense that is, I want to talk about this really beautiful structure, the human nervous system. And it is really an amazing thing. Perhaps, and we haven't been to all places on the planet, or even, in the universe, much less the planet. It may be the most complex thing that we know about. It is absolutely an astonishing thing. And in an hour and a half, I'm going to try to give you an overview of that. I realize 2 things. Number one, of course, that's inadequate. People spend 3 or 4 years getting degrees in kind of neuroscience. But also, all of that's changing, how we feel about this. Much of what I'm going to be saying today, not just in this particular session, wasn't known 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. Everything is evolving with this. And so the first thing I just want to mention about is just your neurons to begin with. These little cells that connect. There are in your brain, not including the rest of the nervous system, 100 billion neurons. There's 1 trillion cells altogether in the brain, but actually the number of neurons is 1/10 of that, or 10%. And we get a little bit of alien kind of fatigue. We hear things, especially when they start talking about things like the national debt, right? So many, it's just aliens. And so 100 billion grains of sand, if we had 100 billion grains of sand, they would fill up this space here to about 4 feet. That's how much that is. And if you took the trillion cells, it would just go way over this, and they were grains of sand, they would go way over this particular structure. That's how many cells there are. They're just really amazing. And as we have there, they have about 5,000 connections for each neuron on the average. They have these axons and dendrites that are going off in all different directions. And each neuron fires an average of 5 to 50 times per second. This is an amazingly complicated, amazing amount of energy that is going on. It actually is a little bit presumptuous of us as humans to think that we can actually figure this out, that this is what's going, but we're doing our best. The brain is about 2% of body weight, but uses 20% of the energy. So, and at any rate, we all have that's why we're here today, to figure out what the brain has to do with this. So I want to go over in this particular session how the brain actually works or maybe the nervous system as well. And in future sessions here, we're going to connect it more to spirituality, but this is kind of a sort of really kind of nuts and bolts thing, and see if I hope people can kind of get a background with that. There are actually 150 different types of neurons. Some are very, very specialized. So it's not as if they're all just one thing. We all kind of have similar skin cells. The skin cell on the palm of your hand is equal to the skin cell on your elbow, and they're not much different. But the neurons are different in all different kinds of configurations. So how do they work? How do neurons work? They're, in this kind of almost science fiction-y sort of way of being, they have a cell body and then all of these little connections that are called axons. And at the end of the axon, big, long, kind of tubular thing, there are these things called dendrites, which are full of neurotransmitters. And it's a very binary system. If you're used to computers, a neuron is either off or it's on. That's kind of how it goes. And the theory I like to do is a dunk tank. Not the kind of dunk tank where you hit a target, but if you could imagine someone in a dunk tank. Anybody ever done that? I'm sure, yeah. If you threw enough sort of wet water balloons and that person got heavy, boom, it would go down. So one of the things that these things are is they're firing water balloons. Your brain is firing little water balloons at each other. All these little neurons are acting that way. They're throwing these neurotransmitters, and when enough neurotransmitter hits the other end of the neuron, then it fires, and then it sends off neurotransmitters. And it's just an amazing dance that goes on all the time. And we're, like I say, we're still trying to figure out what all of those consequences and things related to it are. So there are many different types of neurotransmitters, these little messengers that go on, and it's not exactly clear why they should be in one area or very much over another. As a matter of fact, some of these things that are going on, we're not even sure how they even work right now. So, for example, one of the big ones that everybody hears about is serotonin. And that's because so many people are taking things for depression or other kinds of mood disorders that are called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And if you look even on the information from the pharmacies these days, no one really knows how they work, even after 30, 40 years of this sort of thing. But most of your neurotransmitters are either they stimulate the neuron to fire. And that's mostly glutamate. Glutamate is actually an amino acid, and it's being manufactured, as opposed to the other one which is turning things off, which is called gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA. GABA is a turner off, and it's a kind of nervous system depressant. Alcohol is one of the best ways to release GABA. So if you want to know what happens when you have a lot of GABA, drink 3 martinis real quick, you'll get a real good idea about that. And that's why a lot of these things that we go on when we start talking about, say, using pharmacology to help people with mental health, for example, we need to be really exacting about it, because we won't want GABA to go everywhere. So another medications Another group of medications that works on GABA are what are called the benzodiazepines. They are Valium and Librium and Xanax and a whole bunch of other things. And they're not as broad. They go for all of these sorts of things. They have various receptors. This is complicated. It's not as if there's just one receptor on a neuron for glutamate. There's several types, or for GABA. So that's the main dance, though, is between glutamate and GABA, turning things on, turning things off, really very, very automatically, very, very automatically. So much happening below the surface that you're not really aware of. Dopamine has gotten a big sort of public awareness thing because dopamine seems to be the transmitter of addiction. And deep in your brain, a place called the nucleus accumbens is where all that sort of stuff happens. Dopamine is also a really big thing for anticipatory kind of joy and pleasure. So the reason that, and it can be quite problematic in people who have things, have very complicated diseases like schizophrenia. There are all sorts of things going on with that. So I mentioned dopamine because everybody hears about it. And there are certainly medications that affect dopamine, but it's not the only thing that kind of goes on with addiction. But we do know from all of our studies which neurotransmitters do that and which neurotransmitters kind of do something else and where they act. You think about dopamine, like dopamine is only affecting about maybe 3-4% of the brain at most. Yet you hear about it while glutamate and GABA are basically going all over the place. Opioids, and you people hear about this, there are opioid receptors. The reason that opioids work for us is because we have natural opioids. So one of the things that I actually ask people to do when I have a little talk on mindful exercise that I have given to my health club. And one of the things I tell people to do is when you are actually finished, especially something that's rigorous, like a strong cardio session, you get an opioid flush. Your brain releases, a lot of opioids. And since exercise seems to be an uphill battle for so many people, I say one of the ways you do that, what I find at my health club, and maybe you do too, is that people are doing this, but they got to go somewhere. And so they go and they're finished doing their thing. They're like immediately jumping into the shower, doing that stuff. Usually by the time they've gotten off of their stationary bike to get to the locker room, they're already on their phone. So I tell people, and this is an excellent thing to do if you're an exerciser, is to just wait and feel the opioid flush. Just feel that. It'll help make your exercise a bit more reliable and more enjoyable. It's kind of a thing that we have to struggle against, is just being able to do things that we don't like, that are unpleasant to do, that we have to push ourselves to do. So that's one other thing. Cannabinoids, I'm not going to mention much about that, except there's good research that has been very valuable for pain relief and other things. PEA, this is one you may not have heard much about. It's kind of one of my favorites because it's so quirky, and it's a very small neurotransmitter, a small percentage of the brain having neurotransmit. I'm going to tell you a few things about what PEA does, and then maybe you can guess what it's supposed to be about. When PEA is high, you have trouble sleeping, you have trouble eating, you have kind of obsessive thoughts, and you seem to be in sort of a dreamy place. PEA is the hormone of falling in love. It's really true if you say it like that. Well, you can't eat, you can't sleep, and you're all distracted all the time. It doesn't sound like it's a great place to be. But PEA is one of those things that has to do with that. And it is true. This is one of those things that you hear the people who make chocolate talk about, that there is PEA-like substances in chocolate. Whether that really does anything, I mean, it's always hard to know. For example, if you wanted to, say, increase the amount of dopamine in your body, you swallow dopamine, nothing happens. Your body breaks it down long before it gets to the nervous system. So I'm not sure that the PEA in chocolate does that, but that's kind of one of those things that people really are maybe not aware of. Phenylethylamine, and then oxytocin. Oxytocin is one of the most powerful things, especially as we're talking about spirituality, and especially after our first session on connection. Oxytocin is the hormone of connection. Oxytocin is the thing that it comes out when people are really getting close to each other, when you recognize somebody in your own tribe. So when I came in to this session, most of you I've never met before. That's good. But, there are a few of you here that I have met before that have, come to the Mindfulness Center in Milwaukee, or I've known in some other way. I'm sure I got an oxytocin flush. I'm sure we all kind of do that. Your dog, if you have a dog that is really, really attached to you, your dog gets an oxytocin flush when he sees you, especially if you're hiding that treat behind your back. But, so oxytocin is a wonderful thing. But I also like to say that oxytocin may be the most dangerous molecule going. Because when we talk about that connection, it is initially for your tribal group. I have no way of knowing, but I would bet a lot of money that I would be right, that the terrorists that flew planes into the Twin Towers were loaded with oxytocin when they did it. They had this bonding of being part of something, that sort of thing. So oxytocin can be, in that way, a dangerous thing. It can bind you tribally, but maybe beyond. But so we need to be aware of that. But it clearly is there, and a very powerful, powerful substance. You may or may not have actually been getting a little bit of oxytocin last night when you were doing the loving kindness meditation. So there's lots of ways to kind of go about that. So, and I wanted to mention, just because it is, we're doing a weekend on spirituality and the brain, that there is, I forget what all of the numbers for VMAT stand for, VMAT2. VMAT2 is an allele. If you have something that's a gene or a hormone or a receptor or an enzyme, and it's changed just a little bit, that's called an allele. And this is a slightly different way for doing this thing. T stands for transport, I know that. What VMAT does is it takes the molecules that are of neurotransmitters that are being made in the center of the nerve cell, and helps transport them to the end of the nerve cell where they're going to go. No reason why we know this, but we do know that people that have the VMAT2 gene are more spiritual. The person who created this or discovered this, he didn't make up the name, but right after that, people started calling it the God gene. So at least some of our spirituality may be inherent. And you can even see that. I remember seeing one of those like 60 Minutes programs about this, where some guy very spiritual, his brother wasn't, and it's just that they didn't have that particular gene. So many little things that are being kind of worked out with that. You may have heard about genetic differences in all sorts of conditions. Always be a little wary, because this is a complicated system, but it certainly does seem that a lot of the way we are is just the hand we're dealt. So do people who have the VMAT2 gene, do they have the choice not to be spiritual? Yeah, they probably do. But it is a kind of a thing where there's a tendency. Not everybody starts on that kind of playing field. So this is a picture of your brain, the inside of your brain, the limbic system. And we're going to talk about what parts that is. This is your kind of emotional center. It is really complicated. There's a couple things that I want to really sort of just notice is the amygdaloid body, the amygdala. The amygdala gets a lot of play these days because it seems to be the source of anger and fear, of kind of quote unquote negative emotions or unwholesome emotions. And so that's where that all plugs in. The other parts about that are your, where is it? I think they're, yeah, the hippocampus is over there on the right. That big sort of purple sweeping thing is where a lot of your memories are and a lot of your sort of narrative memories are about who you are and what's going on. And the, just as I really, an area that I feel is being maybe not necessarily neglected, but is really interesting is almost at the very center of your brain, something called the thalamus. It's mostly gray matter, not a lot of white matter, a lot of cells. And it is the way station for lots of things. Every one of your senses, with the exception of smell, checks in to the thalamus before it goes to the surface. So when you're looking with your brain will see something and it will actually go to the thalamus first before that. If you touch something, it goes to the thalamus first and then goes up to that. So really interesting how that is. And the only thing I know about meditation or spirituality is with this is that people who are meditators have asymmetric thalamus, because all of these things are paired organ. There's two hippocampuses, there's two amygdalas, one on the right, one on the left. And I don't know what that means. It means something, because something's happening, but it's really interesting. The hypothalamus is right there. And for people who aren't aware, the hypothalamus really isn't, there's two parts to the hypothalamus, and one part is part of the brain, but the other part isn't, it's glandular. But the hypothalamus is the thing that takes care of all the metabolic control. So your thyroid hormones are there, adrenaline is there, corticosteroids are there, all of that sort of stuff. So the brain plugs into the ability to release or not release those particular things. Right there on top where all of the emotional centers are. So it's really kind of complicated. Oh, and that big meaty thing under there is the cerebellum. So all these things are really wonderful. I want to just mention that really not always considered part of the limbic system is a cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus may or may not be part of that, but it certainly acts more like the cortical system. And this is your brain, the outside of your brain, if you looked at it from the side. It is not, these aren't these particular colors. It'd be really nice if they were, right? You know, they'd mean something. So there are all these things that are going on. The brainstem is the main part that kind of just keeps us alive. The occipital lobe, and in this picture, it's very deceptive. The occipital lobe is really much larger, and about even in people who do not have sight, 30 to 40% of our sensory input is visual, or at least assumed to be visual. So the parietal lobe is where a lot of language, and from the standpoint of spirituality, it's where selfing occurs. You know, that idea where, who am I? I have this particular thing. I wish to protect this particular thing. this narrative that the parietal lobe does a lot of that. I want to talk about the frontal lobe and what's called the prefrontal cortex. Two things about that. Actually, this is kind of similar. Most things that happen in evolution also happen in embryology the same way, or human development. So we're going to get to the various levels of the brain in a minute. But your frontal cortex is the last evolutionarily thing to come. So, for example, other mammals have almost no frontal cortex. Animals like birds and lizards have practically none. And this is getting larger and larger and more complex. And we talk about the area right in the front called the prefrontal cortex, way in the front, which seems to be an area where we have a lot of our things like decision making and well-being. And we're going to talk about that tonight a little bit, how all that goes. Does anybody know the story of Phineas Gage? Somebody must know that. No one knows the story. You know the story about Phineas Gage. This was one of the first ways that we discovered about neuroanatomy. This was about 1830, 1840, when they were just building railroads. And Phineas Gage was he was a workman who was hitting spikes into the railway. And somehow there was an explosion, and one of these spikes went right up under his eye, boom, and cut off his prefrontal cortex. And it's amazing, of course, we think about how dirty that must have been. There was no antibiotics. It was amazing that he survived, but when he survived, he was completely different. Kind of uninteresting, but before he had been sort of an angry, cantankerous person, now he was kind of mellow. And this led, of course, when people noticed that that kind of actually happened with prefrontal, when you took away the prefrontal cortex, that people would have, that's what a lot of people did surgically before there were any kind of other therapies for things like schizophrenia, especially people who are agitated schizophrenics. The prefrontal lobotomy. Phineas Gage was the first person to get one. He didn't ask for it, but he had it. And if you are a person who, say, if you have a prefrontal injuries, you're a very, I don't know what would be the best way to say it. You're a very dull person. Nothing much emotionally goes on with you. Nothing excites you. Nothing distresses you. And people who have prefrontal injuries, bad prefrontal injuries, who have chronic pain, actually kind of do pretty well. They sort of got an idea that, yeah, I still have the pain, but it doesn't bother me. So this is a very evaluative place. It's also a place where lots of decisions are made. I know of one study where someone had a prefrontal tumor and his whole life was changed because he could no longer make a decision. In the narrative about his case, he was supposed to, he was a person working in an office, and he was supposed to either buy a gross of black pens or a gross of blue pens. And he went a week without being able to make that decision. It just was carrying him up. So anyway, there's a lot of really interesting things going in there. And it's not, like I say, something that a lot of animals really kind of get with. The other thing that the parietal and the frontal lobe do a bit is help give us a sense of, especially on the left side of the brain, we're going to talk about right-left stuff tonight, is a sense of time, past, present, and future. There is a wonderful person by the name of Dan Gilbert, who wrote a book called, great name for a book too, Stumbling on Happiness. And his main theory, which is, I think, really borne out, is that one of the things that make people unhappy is thinking about past, present, and future. He says, man is the only animal that thinks about the future. Really is kind of true. Another guy that I talked about last night, Robert Sapolsky, wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's great. And I've sounds very Robert Sapolsky like. You're a zebra, and suddenly a lion comes. And of course, you get all the fight flight stuff going on. You're running around, you're getting away, you're going through this valley, you're going over these rocks, you're trying to make the lion not follow you. And then finally, the lion gives up. When the lion gives up, the zebra goes back to eating, doesn't think anything about it. But we don't do that. Whenever we have an event like that, we hold on to it forever, and we always replay it and run it. And we always think about what might go on in the future. So we are unique in that past, present, future thing that continues to, in many ways, inform our decisions. So if we didn't have an idea about past, how would we ever build anything? Every generation would be brand new. No one remembered how to build a fire. I guess we'll have to figure it out. But there's a cost for that in the fact that we have regret about the past and worry about the future. And the parietal lobe is a big place for that. I want to mention, I couldn't go away without mentioning, even though we're not going to talk too much about it, to what there's a neuroanatomist right down the road here in Madison called Richard Davidson. And we're both in agreement that our favorite part of the brain is the insula. Now, I can't even show you the insula on there. It's kind of folded in that area between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. It's kind of inside of it. And what it does is it determines whether you like or dislike something. And it does it very quickly. It's not the only thing it does, but one of its things. So if you have something that happens to you that especially is kind of a threat, you are aware that you don't like it before you even know what it is. So let's just take an example. If there's somebody that you just don't get along with and you hear their voice, before you know it's him or her, your insula has said, don't like that, don't like it. And this happens, your ability to like and dislike things happen in 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a second, boom, quickest thing going. So the reason I mention this especially when it comes to people who are doing sort of spiritual practices, is that judgment, which the insula does, is very quick and very automatic. And I think it would be a really difficult task to become non-judgmental. I mean that on one term where judgments are made. It is absolutely a wonderful practice to be mindful that your mind made a judgment. But if you hear that person's voice, your insula is always going to say, don't like that person. Always going to have that, but you can have the choice to reevaluate that. I also say this because at least in Buddhist circles, or especially in the secular Buddhist circles, where people start talking about using mindfulness for things like mental health, they always push, or not always, they frequently push the idea of non-judgment, but they don't really explain it. And I have had people come to me and say, I'm really failing at this because I can't get rid of our judgments. So I don't know why he did it. There's a very good practitioner in our practice, helps lead the group that meets in Waukesha. And we're having a summer retreat. I'm going to have flyers for that before the end of the retreat. And he mentioned, kind of just off the top of his head, we usually have talks starting at 9:30 like this one. He said, I've been counting. Since I got up this morning, I made 50 judgments. So we're doing it. We're doing it all the time. This is natural. And you kind of like need to have that judgment, right? So, if you're crossing the street and an automobile's coming to you, you don't get into that mindful state. Wow, that's really interesting. Look at the red on that car. I don't think I've ever seen. No, you want to get out of the way. So you definitely need that part of your brain to be judgmental in that regard, but it tends to overdo it. Yes?
I had heard from somebody at one time that, the original fall from grace in the Garden of Eden?
Yeah.
That didn't have any judgments. They
Right.
everything's fine. And then, I don't know, maybe they grew a insula or something.
Yeah.
But
No,
that was,
yeah.
apparently when man was given the choice to judge or not.
Yeah. Very good. So the question was about the whole thing going on in Adam and Eve's fall for grace, which was they didn't think things were good. And there's a wonderful line. I don't remember what Shakespearean play it was, but Shakespeare said, "Nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so." So that is really kind of the idea with that, is that what we do suffer from is these kind of instantaneous judgments. And yes, if you look at that biblical allegory, people forget about that. What was the apple tree called? It was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Interesting, huh? So when we put people into categories on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence, now, of course, we need to do that sometimes. We need that as a very much a survival mechanism, but it's way, way overdone, way, way overdone. And so if you are, listening to NPR and your favorite or your least favorite politician comes on and you hear the voice and you feel that twinge, that's your insula talking, and that's okay. You don't have to go there. You don't have to stay there, but realize those kinds of judgments are extraordinarily common, and not only common, in many cases will save our lives. Maybe 1% of the time it's going off, it's going to save our lives. The other 99% of the time is just nuisance. So please be a kind of aware of that. Anyone else? Anything else? Yeah. 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 Well, yeah. So the question is about whether you have to be exposed or anything else. No, there's probably certain things that are inherent in the insula right from the word go. So, for example, people have a fear of falling. And that's right there in the insula right away. So if you're at the edge of a cliff, your insula will fire saying, whoa, don't go there. Many people, and I don't have this, which is really good for you guys, have a fear of public speaking. I just go out and do it. But many people do. So there are certain things that are inherent and certain things that are learned. I don't know, this is a weird sidebar. I don't know if koala bears have an insula. They probably have something like it. But we know that koala bears in Tasmania are still afraid of snakes, even though they haven't seen a snake in Tasmania for 3 generations. It's all part of them. So they see a snake, they recoil. So some of what is going on in our insula is pre-programmed. Some of it is clearly a relationship to what's going on in our lives. Yeah. Fortunately, though, we have the ability to be neuroplastic. We have the ability to change our mind, to kind of work with it. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about something where one was larger than the other.
The insula seems to be equal. Yeah. No, the insula is the same on both sides, but it definitely is for one of what we're talking about. This idea about judgment, it's definitely the right insula that's doing most of the work. And I should just mention before we get off on the insula is also the place, especially on the right, where we have things like proprioception. So I'm holding my hand out. How my body knows I'm holding my hand out is the insula saying, hey, your hand is right there. The other very interesting part of this is the insula also seems to be the place of empathy. So when people have empathy, they have a lighting up of their insula. Why is this important? It gets back to embodied practice. It's not just our bodies, but the way that we get body language from other people. So your insula sees somebody who has an angry stance or an angry face, it's going to light up. That's because it has body knowledge. That's your right insula that's doing that. And so I always like to say that when we talk about compassion practices, and we do have specific compassion practices that we do, that things that involve body awareness are inherently compassion practices. Even though you may just go to your yoga studio or do your Tai Chi and not think of it, you are developing compassion by developing body awareness. So body awareness is very key. And again, we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. So yeah. Anyone else? So this is a model that many neuroanatomists are driven crazy by because they say, oh no, it's not like that. But it does kind of at least give a little bit of a background. The first thing I want to say is that the absolute all or none part of that is not really true. It's like whether they're developed. So for example, the lizard really does have a limbic system and a cortex. They're just very, very immature. So the first foundation in mindfulness is called the non-physical body, and that's just pre-vertebrate things. And, that's maybe something like a sponge or a mollusk, something like that. Things come, things go, you respond to the environment. Doesn't seem to have obvious sentience, but I realize that that's a really judgmental statement as a human being for me to say that mollusks don't have sentience, but they might. But I'm just saying it's not real obvious with that. Now the other, and that's part of our brain. Let's see if I can go back. Oops, going the wrong way. That's the brain stem. That's the first part. That's mollusks have that. The second part, the lizard has that. The mollusks have what's even below that, just very simple nervous system things that maybe I'd even get to at what they might have as a brain. The lizard has a brain, and the lizard has mostly a brainstem to act and has a very simple way of looking at the world from the standpoint of things. Most reptiles, their response to danger is freezing, and they can stay frozen for a long time. Very, very simple stuff. Don't seem to have any kind of real complicated emotions. The third level of the brain in the triune, second level in the triune brain, lizard first. On top of that is the mammalian brain or the squirrel brain. I don't know why we picked squirrels. We could have picked, marmosets or possums or whatever. But they have a limbic system, and this has emotions. This has more of a thing like that we would see as either anger or happiness, joy, they're just fear, all of that sort of stuff is happening. And that kind of circular thing where the limbic system moves around, yeah, we'll see that in the squirrels and the rats and all that other sort of thing. But the squirrel doesn't have much of a cortex. Now, when I say that, I say, yeah, they do, but it's, this model assumes that the squirrel doesn't have any cortex. Yeah, the squirrel does. Obviously, the cortex is where people initiate, or squirrels initiate movement, so they have to have that. But the last level here is what is called the primate brain, or monkey brain, which is what we've got. And that's a larger cortex, which has the ability to have intellectual concepts, such as we were talking about as past, present, and future, language, and social systems. And all of this sort of stuff is relatively late in the neurologic development. So interestingly, enough about that is all of these things have baggage associated with them. So, for example, one of the things that sort of made humans kind of break out, be able to leave Africa, be able to form more complicated societies, develop agriculture in city states and then not do it so well, all of that sort of stuff, is related to language. And language is, of course, a wonderful thing. How much have I gained? How much have you gained from being able to, read a good article or to hear somebody speak on a YouTube video? But the thing that's happened with that is that there's also a downside to that. There is a particular group of people that do mindfulness as a type of their psychotherapy that's called ACT. It's called acceptance and commitment therapy. I don't know if any ever heard of that.
What's the name of that?
ACT, A-C-T.
Stands for?
Acceptance and commitment therapy. It's got 6 modules. One is mindfulness, but their whole point of view is really interesting because the people who are therapists in this were originally linguists. And they're saying the whole problem is language. That's why people are messed up. It's all language, and that's their point of view. And you could make a point for that. I mean, a lot of the things that we have are related to language. Certainly our individual frictions with other people are related to language, and we can't do language well, we have lots of problems. So this is, for example, one of the things that's difficulty with people who have things like autism and schizophrenia. They just don't get the language. They don't know the things like prosody and intent behind things. They just can't figure that out. So this is a common thing that people talk about, the triune brain. You'll hear that. So yeah.
I have a question about the slide.
Yeah.
So on the left column, you have third down is feelings. And
Yeah.
then the fourth down, below mind in parentheses, is emotion.
Right.
Can you tell me
Yeah.
the difference?
Yes, very much. I'm glad you mentioned that. So one of our problems here, and by the way, that left column is related to a Buddhist concept called the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The second of those 4 foundations is something called Vedana. And Vedana is one of my favorite things to do with practice. It was translated, we in modern America, well, modern anything, are at the whims of 18th century British anthropologists, because they found a lot of this stuff and then they made the translation. So the translation of Vedana was made into feelings, but it really is more like feeling tone. It's like, dislike, don't care, as opposed to anger, joy. So that's why the third level is what we call the area of mind, is where the true emotions are. The very basic part about whether we like or dislike something is what it is traditionally called feelings. And I understand that's confusing, but I'm glad you brought that up because, boy, that really ends up in a lot of places for confusion. So, anything? Yes.
Just follow up. So feelings, choices, I prefer watermelon over oranges.
Yeah.
But emotions, emotions can turn into judgments. That's good.
Oh, sure. Well, feelings can
I
turn.
prefer.
Yeah.
Is that the difference?
Well, they can, but they don't have to either. That's part of the practice. So,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So you may have an emotional response to somebody, but you don't have to go down a path of hatred, for example, just because you have that emotional response. So, sure. Whoops, go the wrong way. So these are how the brain changes. Just so you get an idea about what you can do either, or you did do in the past. The first way that the brain changes, surprisingly, is a thing called pruning. In all of your development, you had more brain cells when you were a 6-month-old fetus than any other time. The 6-month-old fetus has 200 billion neurons. By the time they're born, if they're born at irregular gestation, they're down to 130 million, but they still have more than you. So all you people who have, like, children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews, you're looking at these little babies, they got a lot more brain cells than you do. And there's really an interesting part about this pruning process, which isn't really very active or important after about, age 10 to 15, is that certain people don't prune well. These are autistic. A lot of the autistic people do not prune well. They've always got extra cells that seem to be in the way that are giving difficulties. Some people keep pruning way after the time they're not supposed to. Many of them turn out to be schizophrenic. So the pruning system doesn't turn off, which is why, since you're normally pruning from into your second decade, why people who have things like schizophrenia always seem okay when they're 12 or 13, but aren't when they're 22 or 23, because they never stopped pruning. And it's just kind of an interesting thing and doesn't have much to do with that. Myelination. So your brain cells are connected with these axons, and the axons have just normal membranes, and that doesn't conduct so well. As time goes on, you form more and more fat around these things. That's called myelination. The fat is called myelin, and it's a big insulator. It makes the system be more true and to travel quicker. So, and it's made of fat. So, and it's something that starts a little bit before birth, but then kind of goes on with that and isn't complete in the human brain until about age 25. You're still myelinating, especially those people who, if you've ever wondered what was going on while your adolescent wasn't doing so well, it's that one of the last places to myelinate is the frontal and prefrontal cortex. And when you're not myelinated, you're not connected. And so that's why adolescents often seem irrational and strange. I remember, I don't know how she feels about it now, but when my daughter was a teenager and just acting out, I'd say, just go to your room and myelinate. We'll all be better if you just do that. And the other thing about myelination is it's fat. So that's what really is the white matter in that white matter stuff. And some of the systems that go on in the brain are very quick because of this myelination. So more fat in your brain is good. So I'm just saying, if you have somebody who calls you a fathead, say, well, thank you very much. Important stuff. Synaptic formation, which is the thing that people are talking about more. That's probably, as adults, more the thing that we do. We form more synapses, and synapses that aren't being used tend to dissolve. So the idea, and I put it as the last one, neurons that fire together, wire together. This is why, for example, you can learn to play a musical instrument, and after a while, you learn to play a music instrument seamlessly. All your neurons are all fired. There's whole processes that have gone on with that. And so therefore, we can be intentional with that. When you were doing loving kindness practice last night, you were affecting parts of your brain involving love and compassion. Those neurons were firing. And if you continue to do that, they continue to fire, and you can learn love and compassion the same way you can learn to play a guitar. It's exactly the same thing. The more you do it, the more it goes. And also the other part about that is also true. If you have a habit energy that is not very useful for you, that has been causing a lot of difficulty in your life, if you let it go and don't use it, those little neurons tend to disappear. So this is the main thing that happens with our spiritual practices. We increase, hopefully, the things that we wish to increase: love, compassion, and connection. And we let go of things that may be what we would call unwholesome, and sort of go with that. This is a constant process that's happening anyway. You might as well take some agency with it. So the other thing that is commonly now seen that's really, really interesting, and no one knows how much this is one of those newer things, is this thing called neurogenesis. When I was back in medical school, which was, just after they had decided that bloodletting wasn't such a good idea, been a while. But by the time I started medical school till the time I got out of medical school, they had already changed their mind. But initially, when I went to medical school in 1974, there was this idea that, well, you got a bunch of neurons when you're born, that's it. And guess what? If you do bad things like drinking, they're going to die. So you better, I remember reading one article and doing the math, which said the way they were talking about it was that if you drank 2 beers a day, you would run out of brain cells by the time you were 60, something like that. So I kind of knew that wasn't right, because I knew people who were drinking 2 beers a day, and they may not always be the most functional people, but they didn't run out of brain cells. So neurogenesis is one of those things that is not only interesting that it happens, but maybe we can do things to promote it. We'll see how it goes. Of those 150 some odd types of cells, some of them are very, very sensitive to neurogenesis, and some aren't. Some of your brain cells are the exact same brain cells you've had since the time you were, 3-month-old fetus. They haven't really changed. They're still there. They have a very long life. The one that's really interesting is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an area that's very sensitive to stress and very sensitive to difficult moods. So people who have depression, their hippocampus just shrinks away. When their depression alleviates, they spring back. So this is a really common place among all those places where neurogenesis is actually kind of happening. Important to know among, hippocampus is there for things like memory, why people who are under stress don't do so well. Because here, classic example of how your hippocampus might do this. This may all happen to people. Certainly happened to me, I'll say. If you go back to college or high school and you're studying for that test, but you're really, really worried about that test. You're really worried about that test. And you go in and you take the test, right? I don't remember number 4. I know that. And you hand your paper in, and then 5 minutes after you walk out, oh yeah, that's what it was. While you were in that particular area, you were flooding your hippocampus with mostly stress hormones, and it wasn't functioning. After you left the test and you said, it's all over, it alleviated and you remembered again. So, those kinds of things. So memory is really, really very much tied to those kinds of stress hormones and how we could go off on a whole riff on memory. But these kinds of things are very, very fluid. So any questions about any of that? So I want to just mention what I think may be a special case. I don't know. And in the idea about spirituality, we know that young children have a couple of things about their brains that are different. Number one, they're not that myelinated yet. They're, still have, relatively immature systems, frontal lobe isn't that plugged in. Number two, and we'll talk a little bit about systems tonight, but there are these 19 or so brain systems, there's probably more of them, that all separate from each other but they're not really separate when you're a child as well. So what we have, our daydreaming network, AKA the default mode network, which we'll talk about tonight, is there, but it's not really disconnected from other things. So you wonder, when children have experiences, we just brush it off as imagination. We just brush it off as something that, well, they're just the way they are. But the question might really be begged, do they really have something? Can they really have a perception on some level that we can't? Because their brains are really different. And I don't know the answer to that, but I find that a really intriguing thing. But the child's brain is not the same as the adult brain, and we always look at it as a disadvantage. But maybe there isn't. Maybe there's something to it. Hard to say in that area of spiritual development that kids go through. So, like I say, that's one of those areas that I like to say, I don't know. It's up in the air. How would that be? So. Oh, well then, if it's a story that begs to be told. Yeah. Wait. Okay. Hold that up.
My daughter was in medical school when her daughter was born. And around the time, it really feeds back, okay. About the time that she was 1, my husband passed with a brain tumor. And so Evelyn knew Roger, Grandpa Roger, but she didn't really know him. When he walked in the room, she would smile at that age. So now we fast forward to when she's 4. And she is sitting in the back seat of the car. Her mother is driving to the hospital to pick up a prescription for another child. And out of the blue, Evelyn says, "Mama, Grandpa Roger says you're driving too fast." And that is exactly what he always said. That's exactly what he always said whenever he rode with her. "Terry, you're driving too fast." But Evelyn was 1. I believe you.
Yeah. Well, I'm very open to all kinds of interpretations about those stories, but I do think it's very interesting. And I just think maybe we should at least listen to children a little more about these things, have some curiosity about it, as opposed to saying, oh, well, they're imaginary friends or just whatever, and kind of go with it. Who knows? Who knows? So any other questions or comments? Terrific. So, maybe I want to wait for that. I wanted to do a practice with you that is related to just having a connection with the world in general and its very complicated interchange. I mean, it's amazing. Not just, I didn't even mention this, not to mention that we have these electrons, these 80 octillion electrons, all buzzing, all of us. I mean, in each one of us. But as we're sitting here, thousands of neutrinos are ripping through our body. Neutrinos are these particles that are put out by the sun. They go right all the way through us, all the way through the earth. They're right through, there they are. I mean, weird stuff like that is going on all the time. And for us to be in our little bit of our sensory way of being, sort of seeing how things are, we're a little bit, maybe we should be a little more humble about that. By the way, how do you guys like the world you created? I'm going to talk about this a little bit tonight too, but you have created this world. What do I mean by that? We all get a certain amount of raw material and we construct it. Like babies, so everybody talks about how babies, quote unquote, can't see, that they have to have a certain number of months. Actually, their hardware, the way the eye works, it works perfectly right away. It's all software that has to be. They have to have the experience of seeing before they can know that. And another example is as you're sitting here looking at me, about maybe, if you're looking straight ahead, maybe a little bit off to the right, a little bit off to the left, you have a blind spot. It's where your all of your nerves go into your optic nerve, and you can't see anything there. You know, if you go to the ophthalmologist, they make those plots on that. Do you notice a big void in your vision? Do you notice a big dark spot? You don't see that. Why is that? Your brain has filled it in. Your brain says, oh, well, you know, that wall looks like that. So the wall next to it should look like that. So I'm going to fill it in. We're doing, but that's the real obvious thing, but we're doing those kinds of things all the time. All the time. We are very much living in a virtual reality. We can hopefully decide to take the right color pill. I forget which is the color pill you're supposed to take if you want to see things there. It's the blue pill, right? Okay, I can't remember. Or is the red pill? I can't remember. Whatever it is. Yeah.
Sorry for raising my hand, but when you talk about the hardware and the baby is developed and software.
Well, can I interrupt? I'm sorry. The folks at home are I got the message that they just can't hear.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you were talking about the baby's hardware is with them, so their eye works, but the software isn't completely installed, so they have trouble seeing. And I'm trying to find an example of that in my brain. And I'm thinking of the one where they painted the floor so it looks like there's an edge that drops off.
Yeah.
And then the babies don't see it. They just crawl right across it. They don't know any better.
Right.
But later, then they see the optical illusion and they won't cross over. Is that what you're talking about with
those sorts
hardware
of
and
things.
software?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or people, this is, you know, so one of the things I have found by teaching in Wisconsin for a number of years is you always have to get cows into the talk. So thank you. You loaded me up to get a cow talk. And if you might see that they used to have these little bars at places where roads came so that the cows couldn't get out because they would step through the bars. That was expensive and nasty and difficult to maintain. And they found out that if they painted 3 yellow lines, they got the same thing. So that's what the cows see. The cows see that they don't go across the line. So, you know, it's those sorts of things, all of those kind. So we obviously know that if we see the optical illusions like the vases and the faces or the old woman and young woman, if you remember any of those, we all know that those kinds of things are happening. That's nice. But what's really interesting is it's probably happening all the time in our existence, especially in our memory. And we're making stuff up all the time. Your memory of how your life was is not accurate. It is not a Photoshop of everything that ever happened to you. You have modified it thousands of times, and everything is kind of different with that. This is really an interesting thing. Our problem, well, it's not really a problem unless we don't acknowledge it. We acknowledge that our viewpoint on the world is accurate. And maybe yes, maybe no. Part of that, like our viewpoint is accurate, is coming from our left brain. And we're going to talk about the left brain, right brain stuff tonight. So I will cover that. But suffice to say that we just kind of always seem to be, you know, living in a virtual reality, some of which is made up because this particular organic brain thought it would be good to be that way. So for example, I got tired of this dreary day, so now I have imagined it sunny, and it seems to be working. I'm glad to see that. So see if there's some sun out there. That's really nice. Or maybe all of you did it too. Who knows? But anyway, I want to do a quick meditation now on air or molecule meditation. So if you would all like to, can they see me? Oh, they can kind of see me, yeah, on the screen. So as comfortable as you'd like to be. So sitting upright and breathing. We have all taken millions and millions of breaths in our life. But have we ever stopped to consider the air? The air has been around for a very, very long time. In this very small space here, relatively, there are some air molecules that have visited 4, 5, 6 of us, maybe more during the time we've been here last night and today. And especially if we go outside, we find that the air that we're breathing was in California a week ago and China a month ago. Very same air, the very same molecules, all being there. We breathe them in and we share. Some of them we transform. We bring in the oxygen to become part of our body. We let out the carbon dioxide to be a plant. Some of these trees around here are part me, as I've been here before, and they picked up my carbon dioxide. I am part of these trees. And they are part of me as they gave me the oxygen that turned into solid tissue, even brain tissue. Traveling from here to there. It is said that 50 atoms or so in your body, right this minute, not theoretical at all, were once part of the body of the Buddha or of Jesus Christ or Joan of Arc or Genghis Khan or Martin Luther King. I like to think that part of the molecules I have are from some poor Chinese peasant from the first millennium, diligently doing the practice, the unknown person who is continuing to work hard. Their echo of what they did resonates right here in this physical space. This enveloping atmosphere penetrating everywhere. And not just on this part right here. Some of the carbon dioxide I breathe out gets captured by the ocean or a lake, becomes a fish or algae or krill that eventually become the blue whale. The shuffling around of all of the molecules and atoms, the tremendous amount of intertwining. But perhaps the most interesting messenger of all are the nitrogen molecules, which make up 80% of what we breathe and do not change. They bear witness. They stay. Over many millennia, of course, occasionally they get captured by fungi, bacteria, and be made into soil, but mostly not. Mostly they just exist, neutral, visiting here and there, everywhere. The very same nitrogen molecules, very same, graced the respiratory tracts of Neanderthal men and mastodons and our hunter-gatherer ancestors, saber-toothed tigers, the old horses of the old Americas. So many of them now long gone. The very same nitrogen molecule that you are inhaling now may have visited a pterodactyl or T-Rex or Allosaurus or a trilobite. May have brushed underneath the great ferns of the old ancient forests. Wherever they can. And all of this, the nitrogen molecules, the water, the carbon dioxide, all the little trace elements that might be seen there, are all part of exploding stars. Earth herself came because of the matter from an old, forgotten now, exploding supernova. Everything is stardust. We are stardust. We're all connected throughout that. And it is truly astonishing that we are able to exist in this particular manner on this particular day. With gratitude, we breathe in the air. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, you're a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened in shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine as children do. We were born to manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. That's a quote from Marianne Williamson. And if you have difficulty with the God part of it, you can substitute Buddha nature or the universe or whatever. But it really is true. There are a lot of things that make me glad I'm a human being, and I'm glad that I'm in contact with you human beings. And one of them is this tremendously complex and beautiful, beautiful, beautiful nervous system. It's just an amazing thing. And just think of the kind of power it is. One of the things about being able to make progress in the world is it requires change, doesn't it? We would rather, I think it was Auden says, we would rather be ruined than changed. We'd rather die in our dread than take up the cross of our afflictions and be changed. But this is what we can do. This is what we can do. This we know from the idea of nothing else, from neuroplasticity, how that is. We know how that goes. We know that we have all this potential to be great. We just kind of doubt ourselves. And I think we'll find out in our next session a little bit about why that is. There are really good biological reasons why we don't want to change, why we fear change, why change is a very difficult thing for us. But we, again, because as thinking human beings, as people who have large hearts and beautiful minds, we can make those changes. I hope we can kind of get inspired about that this weekend or wherever else you're kind of going with that. Before I end up with talking about our Dharma doors and the references, are there any other questions or comments? Oh, I'm just aside. That quote was by Marianne Williamson. And if people think it's Nelson Mandela, which was often, it was seen on the internet for a while as Nelson Mandela because he said it at his inauguration as the first Black president of South Africa. He used that quote. So, but that's Marianne Williamson, a wonderful quote. Any other comments, questions? All right. So, little gratitude, my wonderful. This dog is just loaded with oxytocin. Can't you see it? Just oozing oxytocin. This dog is very happy to see us. The Dharma door is gratitude. I might even say, I think I might even, now that I've already got it on the slide, but the sense of wonder. It's hard to be unhappy when you see what a wonderful kind of consciousness we have, how this is all going on, how we could kind of be with that. So that would be the Dharma door, is appreciate the wonder. Maybe if you have a chance, just look at something ordinary. One of the other things I do as a practice for people when I'm teaching my class is to have them take something really ordinary and be with it for 15 minutes, nothing else. So you might say, pick up this bell and really be with it for 15 minutes and really get to feel like its heft and what all of the individual designs mean and the places where it seems to be dirty or stained, and et cetera, to kind of get a sense of our wonder and connection. There's a lot out there that's just open, if you just open yourself up to it. But we don't trust it all the time. We have been told by our discursive mind, who you will meet next session, that it's not worth it, it's dangerous, stay away. I'm saying just the opposite. If you really want to have a full life, the better thing to do is to open up, even if it's a little scary. So I don't have it on there. The sources I have for this particular session are two, and they're in the handout. One is, once again, Rick Hansen's talking about neurodharma. So he talks a lot about the individual parts of the brain and where they do that. And then I mentioned his name once. Richard Davidson has a book called Altered Traits, which is how he likes to look at that. The idea being that, I don't know, there are people here who know the difference between states and traits. States are just things that are temporary, and traits are things that are more inbred. So if you 20, no, not quite, just about 20 years ago, I started learning to play the guitar, and it took me about 10 seconds to do my first G chord, which is like one of the chords that everybody knows. It's not that hard to do. And every time I had to change, I get another 10 seconds. It was really painful. It was like, why am I doing this? And that was a state to get a G chord. The trait now is I just do it. It's like, there it is, boom. It's just there. So hopefully that's the kind of thing. We can start with states. We can decide to have loving kindness. We can decide to really love all of the grocery store clerks. But after you do it for a while, it becomes a trait. There it is. You don't have to worry about it. Somebody comes in with a pick and save thing. Here, I'm going to melt. So there we are. So, that's the assignment, is to kind of gratitude and wonder, going from there. And boy, I'm really glad we have this brain that helps us do that. Once again, talking about hardwiring versus soft wiring, we already have the software for connection with our tribe. We already have that. Now let's see if we can expand that, add on to that program so that that software connects to all of the tribes, or make everybody into our tribe. That's our goal with that. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful. Our next session here is at 1:30, and we're going to talk about the brain and emotional regulation. Oh boy, that's going to be fun. So thank you. I'll sound a bell out.